This episode of This Agile Life has been brought to you by BrilliantAgile.com, providing Agile and Scrum training, consultancy, and personnel.
BrilliantAgile.com. Done right, it's brilliant.
Recorded on Monday, February 3rd, 2014, in St. Louis, Missouri, This Agile Life, Episode 35, Spam Amos. Get your very own People Work Here t-shirt at booster.com/thisagilelife. Say it loud and wear it proud.
The software industry transforms more and more every day. Agile methods are quickly replacing traditional ones. The question is, are you agile enough? This podcast is devoted to agile and lean software development. Time to welcome your agile coaches on This Agile Life.
Hello everyone, I'm the host of This Agile Life, John Sextro. Joining me, I have three great hosts this evening, starting with Dr. Lee McCauley.
Hey, John. How's it going?
It's going well, Lee. How are you?
I am doing quite well.
You sound great.
Thanks.
Also joining us is Nate Mackey.
Hello, John. Good to be back on the podcast.
Oh, Nate, it's great to have you on the podcast. And our third host joining us this evening is the one and only, thankfully, Amos King.
Hey, good evening, John.
Hey, Amos. Guys, we're going to jump right into our discussion this evening. Tonight we're discussing splitting stories. Amos, I understand that you had a Twitter conversation with someone about this.
I did have a Twitter conversation. I don't know that I should use his name, so you might have to bleep this out later.
Bleep.
But Joe Barnes reached out to me about stories and splitting stories and why to possibly split them. I don't remember exactly how the conversation started. I don't think it started out with, hey, how should I split this story? But it kind of ended up that way, and we moved it to email, and I thought that it might be a good thing for us to talk about tonight and possibly talk about with Joe sometime.
And talk about it we shall. Why don't we start off with discussing why do we care at all about splitting a story? Why would we ever do that?
Well, I mean, from my side, we're kind of going through this process on a project right now as features coming in from the customer. We can't really accomplish an entire feature in a short period of time, and we definitely can't estimate how long it's going to take to do that feature if we don't know exactly how big it is and how many steps it's going to take. Besides, we want to be able to deliver to a customer continuously, right? And we want to be able to continuously deliver small things that continuously add value, so that the customer can give us feedback quickly on those pieces, not put some huge feature that's going to take 3-4 weeks to complete, and then the customer can come back to us and say, oh, no, that wasn't what I meant, or, hey, that was a month ago, things have changed.
Lee, you mentioned delivering features and splitting stories within that. When you talk about a feature and those stories, so you're definitely differentiating, and I just want to point this out for the listening audience. You're differentiating feature, which is a grouping of similar stories that when all put together, those stories are all put together, that those equate to a particular feature. Is that how you've defined them?
That's exactly right. I mean, for us, when we create a set of stories around a feature, it'll come in as one single feature from the customer, and we may even break that feature into into other features. If for some reason the customer has said they want this and this as a feature, then we'll probably break it up into two different things. But then we go through and we might create mock screens, and there might be multiple screens involved in a particular workflow. So you can think of a feature, at least the way we categorize it, is we think of a feature as a single workflow through the system. And it may be the happy path, or it may be an error workflow, or it could be anything, but it's a single workflow. It's not branching out from there. But that workflow may have multiple steps, and each one of those steps by themselves could be its own story, and we can deliver those separately without having the entire workflow completed. So for us, that's basically the difference. A feature is a single workflow all the way through the system, where a story is an individual piece that can be delivered and can immediately provide some value without necessarily completing the entire feature.
I know it sounds like a very basic thing, but I just wanted to make sure we started this podcast off by level setting that so that everyone was on the same page as we were talking about stories, and especially since we're probably going to be talking about stories that are on the large side, since we have a need to split them.
I feel a little different, I think, than Lee. Correct me if I misheard you, but it sounded like stories may not be a marketable feature or something that you can push all the way out to the end.
That's not exactly what I intended. If I said that, or I put that across, that's not necessarily what I meant. What I meant is an individual story is a single thing that can provide value. So you might call that an MMF if you want to, minimal marketable feature. But it's a minimal feature, where the features coming in from the customer are often not minimal features. They're full bore, a full version of a feature with it's the Cadillac version.
Right. Well, right. I think that's fantastic. That might be a show title. There is a Cadillac version is huge. It takes you down the road quite a ways. But part of what I like about splitting out stories into tiny things is the flexibility that it buys both the developer and the customer. Is that if you can split them on tiny lines, you will find that there are little pieces of this feature that may not be as high a priority as the main part of the feature, and you can move into the meat of the site and even find out things that you can just throw away, because as this gets deployed, end users, you find out, we don't need all of this extra features wrapped around this bigger feature.
That's a good point. I mean, we see a lot of times then when customers are really passionate about their product and that we're building for them, and we always love it when they are, they tend to want to throw in all the bells and whistles and all the nice-to-haves all in the big feature. And so that's a really good point, Amos, that breaking those out and forcing what is the core of this feature is really important.
One example that I usually reach to when talking to customers or anybody else about this is a password verification field. So I know that almost everybody out here has signed up for a website and they've had to type in their password, and then there's a second field and they have to type in their password again before they can move on. And that would be one place on a registration where I might split out a story. It's an example I use all the time, is that password verification. Maybe we just the first pass doesn't have that verification. And we find out that because we have password reset, that verification isn't really needed right away, and ultimately, hopefully, we don't ever have to put it in at all, because I personally don't want to type my password 2 and 3 times on every website that I go to.
What would you call that?
As about something you said, Amos. It seemed like you took issue with something Lee said about the feature versus the story, and this is something that as we matured, or as we grew through Agile, that we thought about a good bit, which is, does it make sense to have a story that does something that demonstrates, because it's important for a story to be testable. Does it make sense for a story to be testable and yet not provide any value to the customer without providing, without doing all the other stories that might make it provide value? So the example would be that I've got a place in my system where I can add something. Maybe I can add users, but without the ability to see a list of users, adding a user really doesn't buy me anything. So I can add a user, but I can't see anything that I've added. I've just added them. And do you really want to go to the customer and say, okay, we've finished add user, and now they can go type something in and hit enter, and then it disappears and they have no idea what happened to it? Or do you wait? You make that a story because it makes sense as a story, but you wait until a full set of stories is there that would support them seeing actual value being added to the system?
I think it very much depends on your customer. The scenario that you gave, I've run into and given the customer the ability to add users, but you couldn't view a list of users or anything like that. And really, it came down to, well, I can deliver this to you this week, or you're going to have to wait 2 weeks for the bigger piece where you can see everybody. But part of adding was also allowing them to front load some users that they were inviting to the website. So they ended up having good business value as their administration staff could go in and start entering these users that they were going to then invite personally with handshakes to log into the site. So it ended up being a good thing. But yes, I don't know. There is a point where it's minimal marketable, right? That Lee talked about, but I think that's very based on your customer and the relationship that you have with them.
And it's not totally important. I'm just asking because sometimes developers will get caught up in the fact that, well, if we just add somebody and we don't have a list, then who cares about that? And the customer's not going to get excited about that. So, I don't even want to call that a story. It's only a story if it gives them something useful that they can see. And if we're really trying to split stories, and we really think splitting stories into the smallest reasonable component is valuable, then it seems like we would want to push against that. And here's a tool you could use to push against that: is if you really feel that way, and maybe your customer really feels that way, then here's an option. Do what Lee said: have enough of a feature so it actually adds a full use case to the system, but you can still break up into stories as far as how you accomplish it.
Well, or could you wait to deliver? Right? So you could still do the one story of adding users and then wait to deliver it till the list is done. And it doesn't mean that it's bad. I don't know. I personally think that they're two different stories myself. What do you think, John?
I think this is a difference between a story as a user story that adds value to the user. It's something relatively independent, but that story, even though it has value, it may not be a minimal and marketable. It may not be marketable. It's certainly minimal, but it may not be ready by itself to be released. So it's small, it has functionality in it, but it has to be released along with a few other things to make it actually marketable. So it's still good to create that as a story, because that ability to add a user is something that can be independently tested. It may not be absolutely usable by the users until they have the rest of what you guys discussed in terms of the marketability with a list of users, etc. So I think the problem that we're trying to deal with is more on the side of too large of a story and needing to split the story than being small. And I mean, it's two different sides of the same coin.
Well, let's not also forget about the fact that you can split up stories and you can still demonstrate stories to a customer that don't necessarily have a UI if your architecture allows it. So if you have an API layer that you're building, you can still hit an API and demonstrate that, even if you don't have a user interface yet. So you can split that up if you have to. We don't like to. We would rather do a full slice all the way UI to the back end as an individual story, but it is an option at least to deal with a story from an API versus a UI layer, especially if you have a good separation.
But in the example that Nate brings up, it's not just UI all the way down. It's UI all the way down back to different UI.
Right.
That's where I have the problem, is that it's no longer a thin vertical slice. It's a chunk, thin vertical chunk.
Right. And I guess what I want to just support is, don't let the idea, and even if you have a naive customer and they don't understand the concept of, I'm adding a feature, but I'm not giving you everything that you need for that to be completely valuable yet, but I still want to show you, I want to show you something so you can give me feedback. If they're not mature enough maybe to understand that, and they're just going to get confused and upset if they only see part of it done. That's a lot of ifs, but if you're in a situation like that, don't let that stop you from trying to break things down into stories, and maybe, like Amos said, package it up into a delivery to the customer, but you're still breaking down into more smaller, manageable stories.
Well, and what I found with those smaller, manageable stories is that you give the customer more power to choose what to work on next. What's the priority to work on? If you include the users with the list, the user adding with the list of users, as well as some validations, possibly, that's a lot of stuff that you end up having your team work on, where maybe some of those validations are not quite as important, or maybe the list of users is not quite as important as just letting somebody just chug away at putting people in. So you give them the power back in order to prioritize those things. And if the user add and the list are important to come together, they can be the top two priorities, or right next to each other in the priority list, so that they're very likely to be done within a reasonable time frame from each other.
Well, let's kind of go around the horn here and have each host answer the question, under what circumstances have you had the need to split a story into other stories? And Amos, can you kick us off with an answer to that question?
Almost every story a customer has ever given me, I've had the need to split into smaller stories.
Why is that?
Well, I like the stories to be very, very focused on what they're doing. I think that it is more, I don't even know if this is a word, estimatable. It is a lot simpler for me to estimate something at a day or less than it is for me to estimate something in a week or more. One of our other hosts, sometimes Craig Buchek, is very fond of saying that if a developer tells you it's going to take 2 weeks, it really means I have no idea. So the smaller the story, the easier it is for me to estimate, and a lot of customers want you to estimate things out. Also, it allows me to be more focused when I look at it. I don't know. I think I may be answering this question in a very long-winded way. So that focused ability doesn't just go with me as a developer, but as QA goes on, there's a lot less to forget. And that's the big part, is like almost everything that anybody's ever given me, there's a lot more to it than they even realize. So if I can split it up, then I have less to think about at any one point in time.
Okay, so to boil that down to a few less words.
All the time.
Because the stories are large, because you want to have the ability to better focus on the story at hand and not have to deal with so many other factors. And you want it to be easier for you and your coworkers and your team to provide an estimate for the story.
Correct.
Okay, let's go to Lee.
So I think the answer to this for me is almost identical to Amos's, in that almost everything coming from a customer is probably going to include a lot more pieces than what engineers tend to want to break it down into, and can break it down into if they've had practice in figuring out how to create incredibly loud keyboards
and loud typing. Amos.
Sorry. No, you weren't muted, Amos. So anyway, the idea of breaking down the stories, almost everything that comes from a customer is going to be bigger, only because people don't think like us geeks that do this for a living, in that when we see something, we can see all these little pieces and every little detail that we have to code and we have to make work. And each one of those, in a lot of cases, can be its own story. and has its own challenges, and so breaking those out, most people that don't do this for a living, they just don't see those from the beginning, and so I think that's the reason why.
Can I just hop in and say most people that even do this for a living have a hard time, which is why we got brought up to talk about this.
Right, exactly. That's for sure. So, Nate, what would you say the reasons are why you split stories most commonly?
Well, I mean, the reason that we give our clients most often is that we want to put something in front of them so that we can get their feedback. So we want to be able to deliver to them and let them see how the system's going to look with that thing they just asked for, and give them an opportunity to say, well, you know what, I don't like that, or wow, now that I see that, I have an idea, or, you know, could we do it a slightly different way, or whatever it is. And every time you add something to the system, you learn something that you didn't know before. And so if you try to, it's just the same reason why we do Agile instead of Waterfall. If we try to write everything all at once, then we lose that opportunity to learn from what we did. We gave several episodes back, we gave the example of the walking skeleton. The reason you do a walking skeleton is so that you can learn all the things you need to have to be able to get your system up and running from top to bottom. And if you put too much into that walking skeleton, you are losing the opportunity to learn and maybe do something better. You put as little in as possible so that you can learn from that and be able to make good decisions in the future.
I can't really say it any better than you guys have, so those all sound like great reasons. I think where we need to go next with our discussion is to talk about what are the approaches that we use and coach others to use to take these stories that we want to be able to better focus on, that we want to learn from, that we want to be able to estimate better, and how do we break that story down into smaller chunks. In my experience, this is one of the hardest things for people to grasp in Agile, is how to effectively break a story down. You can do it. I've seen people break stories down without any coaching, but they usually do it poorly and in a suboptimal way.
I see a lot of stories that come out of misunderstanding that don't really have a lot of business value on either end. I mean, if you write let's say you're doing an MVC framework and you write a story that says create this model. There's no view, there's nothing else wrapped. It's just create this model and this database table.
That's typically what everyone does immediately, right? They go, I've got MVC, so story 1 is to create the model, story 2 is to create the view, story 3 is to create the controller. Wrong answer. Immediately bad, right?
That is not a thin vertical slice.
Of course not. But it is, I mean, you can understand why people go to that because it's logical. It seems like the appropriate separation of the work.
And then it's even worse if you say, okay, I'm going to create the model, and you create the view, and you create the controller, and then we'll all get together after we're done and see if it works.
Which it never does.
I've been there.
What do you guys
do? You used
do?
to do it, man. That's
man.
Cool. I know.
It's the good old days.
I had a company recently
that weren't so good at all.
Talk to me about that. And I was like, wait, you still do that? Like, I didn't know people were around that still worked that way. And then they were complaining about all the problems that they had with people whenever they go to interconnect it. And I'm like, well, yeah.
There's a lot of information on the internet about splitting stories, about how to split stories. We're going to have a couple of links to a few resources that I've relied on in the past to share with people to help get them started with approaches for splitting stories. But let's take the example that Amos started with of typical model view controller sort of application. What would you guys suggest? We need to split the story. It's obviously too large. The team is going to require multiple days, maybe a week, to implement the story as it's written. So how do you coach? What do you want to tell people about getting ready to start splitting this story?
The simplest way to split a story is to change the verbiage, the language that you use in order to describe a story.
Okay, so if you just change it, though, you haven't split it. So you're talking about changing it in a way that splits it up.
If you change the way you write it, it will naturally split. From what I've seen.
How so?
So we've heard about the as a in order to I want or whatever that order is there. I can't think right now because I'm moving on to the next part. That is a great way to describe a very large feature. And I actually have many customers who show up with that already in mind. That as an administrator, in order to get more user, or in order to have users on the website, I would like to be able to add and view a list of users, to use Nate's example. So the biggest thing is to get them to think in the way of, I think personally, is the given, when, then steps. And if you can get to that point, then it allows a little setup and a single action and a result of that action. And each one of those given, when, thens breaks down into a very nice vertical story. You actually have something that's demonstrable to the user.
So given, when, then is also known as the Gherkin syntax, is most commonly used with Cucumber and RSpec. Do they use that in RSpec, Amos?
Not really.
Okay.
Cucumber can use RSpec in the background, which is why it often gets linked, but Cucumber can use many other technologies in the background.
So why do you believe that a single given, when, then is the appropriate, or is in and of itself a story?
Well, it meets my criteria. Usually a given, when, then is something that I can do in a reasonable amount of time, and by reasonable, I mean a day or less. It's focused. It has one set of steps to go through. So I can estimate it. It's focused. By splitting it up, let's say I have we'll go back to my example that I use frequently as a registration page, is that if I am going to have validations, let's say the user has to put in an email address. So I would have given a user is trying to register. When they register with a valid email address, then they are allowed to register. That's kind of a very weak story, but it doesn't have anything to do with validations. The next story may be, given a user is trying to register, when they register with an invalid email, they cannot register. Again, it's very small, and this is kind of a naive example, but that separates the validation from registration. And it allows us to move forward quickly and stay focused on what the problem is. QA can come in and say, okay, now I'm going to try to register a good user. Oh, now I'm going to try to register a bad user. And step through just that one focused problem, and we can move on.
I agree with you.
The important part to me is being able to quickly move forward.
I agree with you in general, but there's also the possibility that somebody could write very vague given, when, then acceptance criteria. Given that the system turns on, when I press the button, it will run the payroll. I mean, that's not going to be small enough for a story, right? I mean, there's
true. I haven't really had a user go that broad. That's a very good example of a very broad given, when, then.
I thought so. So it has to be written at a good level, and I think that there's some constraints, some boundaries that we can kind of suggest and give to people to help them out. You want to stay narrowly focused, right? I mean, you want to try and do small bits of a story. So in your example, if it's a user registration page, you may start off with just the first and last name, even though your minimal marketable feature calls for much more information. The first given, when, then that you create, or the first story that you create, could just call for the very basic of data entry to make the user registration page somewhat functional. It's not
so what can I do minimally that happy path-wise can get somebody to register?
Yes.
I think that's important, is happy path is one story.
But that's not the end of the happy path,
Right.
right? that's not enough for the happy path, because there's a lot of other information that I probably want to collect on a registration page that is also included in the happy path. So I think happy path can actually be too large. Nate, did you want to add to that?
I was going to agree that happy path, and that's kind of getting into the previous conversation that we had, that happy path to someone could mean a whole set of steps have been followed, like I push the button and I run the payroll. There's a happy path to that, but it's huge. So you really need to continue to boil it down to what are the different pieces, what are the steps involved in doing what it is you want to do, and can we focus on a step of that or the first step of that and see some value there, or is there a particularly hard part of what you want to do, this happy path, that we could hit first? Is there something really that's going to be challenging or has the most questions or the most risk that we could hit first?
Oh, Nate, that has to be another episode.
Sure.
Of whether we should hit the hard part first or the simple stuff.
Right. It's an option, right? It depends. Not that you'd always do that. It's just a way of looking at the larger story to see if there's a way to break it down into something smaller.
So usually when I have a really large story like that, one of the first things that I will do is try to think of the border conditions, right? So running the payroll, well, what if I've only got one person in the database and I need to write a single check? Or I need to do, I'll think of one little piece of that and try to do the border conditions. Okay, what if there's nobody in the database? What happens? And sometimes those are nice ways to think about individual stories, as those border conditions, if you can't find another way to split it up.
One of the metaphors that I like to use as I'm trying to explain this to folks is, imagine, if you can, that every story, with every new story that you do, there's some percentage chance, there's some dice roll that can occur, and if that dice hits a 20, if it's a critical strike against the project, the whole thing shuts down. And if you keep that in mind, this possibility that at any time the project could end, and you keep that in mind as you are thinking about how to split stories down or how to split up stories, I think that helps you focus on every story that needs to be implemented, needs to be user demonstratable, needs to add some sort of value, rather than expecting that you're going to get to do that next story. And if you kind of use this fake scenario to consider, I've got to make sure that I can deliver as much value in that story as possible without having dependencies on other things, I think it helps put people in the right frame of mind of how to split it up. And therefore you don't think about, I'm going to get to be able to do another story to finish this implementation. You want that implementation, as it's defined, to be done when you're done with that story. You don't want to have to go back and touch that again. But what you may be able to do,
you may not call the same thing done.
This piece is done, but I may have another layer, another slice that makes it more done. So this is done, but it's more done now because I added into our registration example, I added in email and city. So now this thing that I'm building towards is more done. But it doesn't mean that anything has changed with the first story that I did that was last name and first name. I'm just completing more, a little bit more each time for that overall minimal marketable feature. Nate, are there dangers that you can think of involved with going through this process of splitting stories?
Yeah, I think we've encountered before having a story that we know is too big and deciding that we want to split it up into pieces, and then doing that and making all these smaller stories, and after we've finished everything, realizing that something got left out. So we thought we had a full feature delivery, and now we actually don't. And sometimes that's okay, sometimes, okay, well, we missed something, so let's just go put it in. But sometimes that thing that you missed is critical and causes, major rethinking of the entire feature of how you implemented it, and maybe what you did was too naive and that you need to start over. And so, it's in most cases it's fine. It's just that if you're doing something where what you're delivering it's critical for it to be correct, for this new feature to be right before it goes into the system, there could be some challenges there, or it could be something that blows out your schedule. So you thought you had enough time to get all this done, and suddenly there's this piece that you missed. And now you've got to go back and fix it. So having at least some idea of what the complete set of the problem is you're trying to split up is helpful, so that you can at least try to avoid that situation.
Is the leaving of gaps a problem in splitting up stories, or is it still a problem of the overall larger story that you're splitting, like that you just did, there was something you didn't know?
Well, what I've seen happen that I'm referring to is that you take a large story and you split it into pieces, and then people forget about that larger story. So they're not thinking about that larger flow or that larger process or use case or whatever it is, and they're just kind of doing that piece and thinking, okay, I'm done, I've finished this and now I'm done, and not really considering that the whole thing needs to be done. So you come back to the customer and you say, okay, we got this done, and as soon as they start trying it, they realize there's major things that have been left out, because nobody's thinking at that top level anymore. They're only thinking at that really small level. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
So is there a way to get around the vision of that larger story being, like, is there a way to get that out to people so that when they're looking at the smaller story, they still have that bigger vision in mind?
Well, to me, it's doing what you were talking about with the give and when then. That's one way of doing it, is that before you decide, okay, we're done splitting this up, have we come up with all of these, thinking at this high level, have we come up with all of these situations that we want to make sure that we cover? And just again, before you leave that and say, okay, now it's broken and now it's all these smaller stories, go through that and think through it and make sure that you've covered as much as you can think of at that point. And a lot of times that takes care of the problem. It's just that once you start splitting the story up, it's so easy to just stop and not realize that you haven't covered everything.
I would like to just mention to the listeners that it's okay whenever you're working on a story to also make a new story. Put it in the backlog or talk to the customer about it, or if you have the ability to, maybe put it next in the queue.
Amen.
The other thing that I would say is just like we don't generally want developers trying to do UI design, we also need sometimes external help in reminding ourselves about the big picture. And so having a product owner, either from the customer available all the time or a surrogate product owner as somebody inside the team on a day-to-day basis. Some of our teams use our QA as that kind of plays that role. Sometimes our designers play that role, where they have the big picture of what a given feature is supposed to do. And if you can have them involved in the process of breaking down those stories, then you are less likely to leave stuff out.
So mechanically, how do you guys do the story breakdown? We've mentioned that there's an opportunity here to maybe leave gaps, but I think that depending on how you go about this, there's less likelihood to leave gaps. And I'll give you an example of the way that I think that this should be done. If you pull a story down, you say this story needs to be split, then I think that you and maybe your pair, or maybe you and someone, Lee, like you mentioned, maybe an analyst, a quality analyst or a business analyst, can then immediately sit there with that story that's too large or is maybe a feature kind of in hiding, and take that and split that down into all of its constituent parts that you're going to create, and those are going to then serve as the implementation plan for that particular story that was too large. I think if you do it that way, you avoid this scenario where you get tunnel vision as a developer and forget that you're implementing these stories for some larger purpose, and then easily leave a gap or miss something. Is that the way you guys do it, or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I like that, John. I think that's a good tip. Having a conversation rather than the developers just, as Lee said, just kind of arbitrarily deciding where the story should be split and how many pieces it should be in, I think is a good way to go. And I also agree with Amos that if you're moving along on a story and you're getting the work done and suddenly something jumps up that is going to blow out what you're doing, it's going to take another day to get it done rather than the day that you thought it was. Don't just bull through and do it. Go ahead and break it up. So go ahead and put another story on the board and bring that up and see if you can bring what you're doing to a close. And don't take the decision away from the product owner or your customer to decide, that part, we don't need that right now. So that's just a note to developers. I've just seen too many developers start doing that. They see, oh yeah, well, if we do this, obviously we need to do this too, without even considering the possibility that it should be broken up.
And if you don't break it up, you'll never know.
That's right. But in general, John, going back to what you said, I think getting the product owner, the customer involved, talking all the way through it is a great way to do it, because then you're just trying to insure yourself against not thinking of all the aspects of the story and doing something naive.
I think that there's also another piece of this, and that is making sure that the developers have a good overall vision themselves, and you're less likely to get the same instance. So having regular demos that where all of the developers get to see it, not just whoever your customer liaison is that goes to the demos. If you have one of those where one member of your team goes and does the demo with the customer and talks about it, and then they come back and give the information to the developers. I mean, that can sometimes work, and sometimes you have to do that. But if you can get your entire team involved, they can see the big picture and they understand why they're doing stuff, then they're much less likely to miss stuff.
Of course, I couldn't agree with that anymore, Lee. It's ideal, and what I would love to have on all of my teams is that everyone on the team has the same level of understanding about the goals of the project and understand the business domain just as well as the product owner and just as well as a business analyst or a quality analyst. In reality, I think most of the times we have situations where developers love to develop, so they focus very sharply on doing those things and are easily fall into this trap of getting tunnel vision on just churning through stories on the board. And they just pull a story and they churn through it, and they're like a machine and they turn them over really quickly, but because they're doing that way, because they're working that way, they quickly fall into this trap of losing the larger thread, losing that higher level vision as to what's actually going on with the project and why they're doing that.
So I think of it a lot about like testing. I actually call it scope creeper method. Is that while you're working on something, if you have a question, it's usually a good time to write a test. Also, if you have a question, maybe take a step back. Maybe that's a good time to split that story off, have a discussion with your customer, and see where to prioritize that in. Because the more things you get split off, possibly the more things you can parallelize, and possibly the more things that you can just not ever do. So you can get to the fun part of the project instead of spending all of your time working on a registration page.
You don't think that's fun? I think that's fun.
I've made like 800 of them. I'm really tired of it. I wish I could just can it and hand it to everybody, but everybody wants something just a little different.
You wish there was a scaffolding for that?
There is. It's just, I got to edit it just that much every time.
I see. And that's a story.
Everybody can't see me. I was holding my fingers very close together. Oh, you got quiet, John.
I'm not saying anything. I was hoping somebody else maybe had something to say.
Yeah. Well, the other question I have about splitting stories is that, it's kind of along the same lines. Is it possible to get too simplistic with your story? Is it possible? And I'm really asking you guys, when you're thinking about how to get this done, this larger thing that we need to get done, there's probably always a really naive implementation that you could do that is maybe just shy of hard coding, that is really simple and would allow you to get a story done. Is there value to doing that, or how do you determine when the story is too small from when we talked about it being too big, but how do you know when it's too small?
So I think naive implementation versus too small are hugely different. But too small, I think I don't really believe in too small that much. I mean, if I can get value out to the customer within an hour and still provide value within the code quality, so I'm not just putting junk in order to get it out in that hour, then fantastic. I have shortened the feedback cycle on that piece while I've moved on to the next piece. So I would rather
coding
keep
it small. Then it's hard. You could just hard code an answer on every story. Is that the right step to take?
Yeah, I think that's a little too small. If we were playing the keyboard passing pairing game, that might be something I would say is the right size for like a little unit test that I implement, you refactor, that sort of thing. But that level seems a bit too small. And is it potentially deliverable? Could you demonstrate that? The project ended tomorrow. Would you be happy that you completed that much?
I think that's the answer. I think that thing you just said, John, is it something that you actually want to be in your system, like to be in your application? Is it actually adding any value to your application? Because I would argue that besides maybe the view, the look and feel of it, hard coding something doesn't really add anything to your application. So you have to get down, and once you've broken it down so much that it's not adding value, maybe that's the right point.
And for me, if the given when, then, like, let's say we go back to the registration. If I say, when I provide a valid email that I register, if you're hard coded to where it only works with a single email address, I think that given when, then the underlying step, you should be able to change and it still work as long as it meets the actual criteria. If you don't, then possibly you've made it too small.
I would like to add on to the given when then and say you might want to add a so that. So you have a why piece there as well. And if it's really, really tough for you to add a so that onto that story, then you might want to rethink that story. I don't know if that's necessarily too small, or maybe it's just the wrong story, but that's a good addition anyway.
That is, and the other thing about the given when then is also to keep it at a high level. Don't say, given that I log in with amos.l.king@gmail.com, or I register with that, then everything is fine. No, the object of it is to be at such a high level that it says, given I register with a valid email address. It doesn't care what email address, so I should be able to swap that out with any valid email address, and it worked great. Once you get down into the weeds of specifying individual things, then I think that's where we get to the point where you can just hard code things and move on, like Nate talked about.
Some of the things that we've discussed are potentially transient waypoints on a path towards the implementation of a story. For instance, Amos, what you mentioned about your email address and writing your very first test that says, given I enter this email address, that it works. That could be a transient waypoint that you do that one time to make something occur. But then the next step in that is to not be dependent on Amos's email address to be there, right? But that in and of itself, the implementation of being able to capture your one particular email address, back to Nate's point, would not be something that's valuable to the application. even though as important as your particular email address is. We all know it is important.
Now everyone knows what it is.
And please send him spam and hate mail.
I hate you guys.
Hey, you did it to yourself. We did nothing except egg them all on.
Well, if I had said amos.l.king@example.com, most people would have tried Gmail if they were going to spam me anyway.
True.
I see. So spam Amos. We'll see how many emails Amos gets. Is there anything else you guys want?
Next week, so 2 shows from now, I guess, I will tell you how many spam emails I got.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Then we'll know how many listeners we have.
Hey, that's a good test. Is there anything else you guys want to share, impart on our listening audience about splitting stories?
The only thing I would say is I've found that it's really almost an art form. It's one of those skills that you learn over time from doing it over and over again, and noticing which ones are bad stories after you split them and which ones aren't. And there's some guidelines, but you just got to keep doing it and keep practicing and pay attention to the outcomes. It just takes time.
Go
ahead.
That's an excellent point, Lee. Don't stop just because you have issues or problems splitting stories. Keep trying. Keep learning from the stories that you split and the feedback that you get on how well you're splitting those stories. And just like you said, keep trying.
The one thing we didn't talk about yet, I don't think, is another way to split a story is to realize that you don't know how to do part of it, and that you need a spike for it. So, if as you are trying to look at the story and think about how to split it out, think about, is there any part of this that I've never done before that's touching a piece we haven't integrated with before, that is using a technology or a library we haven't used before, and take the opportunity to split that out into a spike so you can learn something about that before you even get started.
And that's where I thought you were going, Nate, when you mentioned tackling the hard part first, was
Sure.
so that you could have that learning so you could execute a spike. And how do you define a spike, Nate?
A spike meaning a code adventure that you go on to accomplish a particular purpose. So, and the important thing to remember about a spike is that you get to not follow any of the rules if you want, if that helps you for expedience to just get through what it is you're trying to discover. But the flip side of that is you are also not allowed to put any of that code into your production application. If you don't follow the rules, then it doesn't go in there. So you may decide that maybe, I'm not going to run this through continuous integration. I'm not going to put tests in it, whatever it is. But if you do that, then you also can't put it into the application. But the whole point of it is to learn. It's not to accomplish anything. That it's not to add a feature. It's just to learn what you need to know about something.
That's a great definition of a spike. Thanks, Nate.
So now my answer is jump onto our Google community and post your story up there, and let's talk about it. Let's split it up together. I've had a fantastic time splitting story with Joe and talking to Joe back and forth, but let's share that with our community.
And you can join our community by going to thisagilelife.com/community.
This week's hottest picks.
Nate, why don't you go first with your pick?
Okay. So my pick today is one that has really kind of changed my life to some degree. I used to be a pretty big video game player and really enjoyed doing that. But as my kids got older, it got harder and harder to do that because there was, different things that they had to do and places they needed to be, and it was just hard to get alone time to play. And in the last year, I would say I've really gotten into playing tabletop games, particularly with my family. And part of that is due to a web show called Tabletop that's part of the Geek and Sundry network on YouTube. That's Felicia Day's network, and Will Wheaton of Star Trek fame, is the one who does the show. And all he does is each show they choose a game, and he sits down with some friends of his, and they play the game on the show with some explanatory text about what's going on. And it sounds like it wouldn't be that interesting, but the show is actually a lot of fun. They do a great job of explaining the game, of making it sound interesting. The banter between all the people playing is great. Will Wheaton really gets into it, and there's a running joke on there because he hardly ever wins. These are always games that he loves, and he hardly ever wins. And so it's a lot of fun. I would highly recommend it, and it's a great way to kind of inspire you to play these games, which I've gotten so much more out of playing tabletop games with my family than I ever did playing video games. So highly recommend that.
That's great. I can't wait to check those out on YouTube. Thanks, Nate. Lee, what are your picks?
Well, I have one that is a blog post by Kelly Waters called 10 Things I Hate About Agile Development. And it's really a bit humorous, but it's humorous because it's true. And she's got 10 items out there that I won't spoil it by giving them to you. But it's some great things about people that say you're doing Agile just because you're doing daily stand-ups, and that's actually her number one, and she kind of explains some of that. And there's 9 others that are kind of like that. So I thought it was a great blog post, and I'd give it a little plug. That's at allaboutagile.com. 10 Things I Hate About Agile Development.
And of course, we'll have the link to that blog post in the show notes. Thanks, Lee. Amos, what's your pick?
All right, so I'd like to call this a shameless self-promotion, but if you read the blog post, you'll realize that it's not all that shameless. It's not very well written, but it's called Smaller is Better, and it's about why to split up stories, more about what we talked to at the beginning, what benefits there are. Unfortunately, I've been in a bet with Craig where we put $1 into a pot every week, and we have to release a podcast or a blog post. So their quality is not the greatest. Enjoy.
Who's winning?
No, it's every week we put $1 into a pot, and then the first person that fails gets all the money out of the pot, or the first person that fails gives up the money in the pot.
I see. Very good incentive.
So every blog post gets to be worth more and more money. Do what?
Is that shameful self-promotion then?
Yes, it is shameful self-promotion. I'm not happy with the quality of the blog post, but I'm hoping that as time goes, I'll get better at doing them all the time.
All right, my pick this week is something called LaunchCodeSTL.com, and this is kind of specific for people in St. Louis. I have a feeling, though, that we have a fair number of listeners in the St. Louis area. And I think that this is a really cool and interesting idea. So one of the founders, I think, of Square has started this thing called Launch Code, and they're opening this opportunity up to new developers, new programmers, and they offer you this opportunity to get some training and then have an internship where they pair you up with a company. They pay you to be an intern, a small amount, but it's money nonetheless. And you get to pair a program with an experienced developer, and you get to learn what it's like to write production code and go through this process. And then in the end of your internship, quote unquote, you and the company have a chance to continue your relationship as an employee. So if you're a St. Louisan and are looking to become a developer, or you know someone who is looking to become a developer, maybe this is something that you can share with them. And I think that this is completely non-profit. So yeah,
I can add
even
to
better.
This actually, John. Jim McKelvey, as you said, one of the founders of Square, is the guy who started this, and it's been completely self-funded, actually. So it was basically Jim's money. They haven't even taken contributions until, I think recently they're changing that. But the first group of people, I think they placed 40 wannabe engineers in various places around St. Louis. Asynchrony got to be one of those companies, and The guy that we brought on, we've already hired and given him a full-time position, and so it's working really well so far. And it's interesting because they bring people on, and then they actually do run them through a little bit of training to kind of get them ready for working in a corporate environment. But Jim's reason for doing it, his stated reason for doing it, was that he always felt really guilty about founding Square and then moving out to the West Coast and then hiring all the great engineers that he knew from St. Louis out to go work on the West Coast. And so he wanted some way to kind of give back to the St. Louis tech community and increase the level of IT capability in the St. Louis area. So I always thought that was cool.
That's very cool. I didn't know that whole backstory. Thank you, Nate. Okay, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my co-hosts for joining me. Nate Mackey, where can folks find out more about you?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Nate Mackey, NateMckie. I also post occasionally on my company's blog.asynchrony.com, ASYNCHRONY.
Great. Lee, where can folks find more about you?
I'm at Agile Atheist on Twitter, and agileatheist.blogspot.com is my blog.
And Amos, where can folks find out more about you?
As always, you can find me on my ugly blog, dirtyinformation.com, or I can be found at GitHub and Twitter at Adkron, that's ADKRON. I look forward to hearing from everybody.
And you can find out more about me, John Sextro, at my website, johnsextro.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at JCSextro. Thanks for listening, and keep living this Agile life.
This Agile Life is brought to you by a community of Agile developers and coaches aspiring to spread the word about this groundbreaking approach to software development. Join us at thisagilelife.com/community.